So my talk is called The Purification of Web Development. And as Divya said, thanks for the introduction, I'm Nicolas Gallagher. I recently moved to San Francisco from London. And I work at Twitter on the Twitter for Websites team. And I'm sure you've had like a long couple of days of like arduous tech talks. And I hope you don't mind if I kind of do a not very technical talk. If that's not really your cup of tea, then like feel free to put your feet up and have a nap and wait for Eric Mayer. My talk is, as I said, about the purification of web development, and more specifically about how in the realm of UI development, as those of us who write HTML and CSS, the term best practice is sometimes coupled with a tendency towards an overzealous search for absolute truths and a purging of alternative ideas. And so before I go into that, I'm just going to briefly go over like why I'm here, which is I work on web apps, quite large web apps. I worked on TweetDeck for 6 months, which is a JavaScript web app. And I rebuilt the HTML and CSS at TweetDeck built on this like layering principle, which I might touch on a bit. And I do a bunch of open source stuff like HTML5 boilerplate, some style guide, and normalize, which I wrote with Jonathan Neal. And that's like an alternative to CSS resets that a bunch of people use now. And despite that, I'm sort of not really a software engineer. I spent most of my time studying science and anthropology, and up until this point, I've still spent more time doing that than I have writing code. But that world was like amazing, and it taught me a lot of things. And despite my knowledge being really rusty in the area of anthropology, there's still a few things that I'm interested in. And that's the questioning assumptions and looking at the history of ideas. So when you go back and look at where an idea was formed and what else was around at the time, it gives you an insight into some of the assumptions that were flying around at the time and some of those that were like coalesced into the ideas that became dominant in the future. And so when you look at the context behind how things that we take for granted and see as absolute truths came about, then it can lead to reevaluation of some current approaches and sometimes expose like interesting or different ways of doing things. And so like as an anthropology student, I spent a lot of time having to study the history of philosophy in the West, which is kind of a bit crazy, and loads of my friends like went insane studying philosophy as a proper subject. And what's interesting though is when you look back on these ideas, so many of them come from over 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. And so when you're exposed to those ideas in their embryonic state, when there's a bunch of people sitting around like thinking about how the world is, and you see that those ideas went on to shape the rest of the world that we take for granted, like everything about what we do, from the way that we conceive of ourselves to science in general, then it's really interesting to look at the ones that were kind of left behind and when or if they ever came back. And there was this one point in time that particularly stuck with me, and I'm going to use it as a mirror to kind of explore some of the entrenched views that we have in the HTML and CSS like development community. So first, a quick detour into ancient Greece. So the first guy I'm going to talk about, and there's only two, don't worry, it's not going to be that long or boring, is a guy called Heraclitus. And he was a pre-Socratic philosopher, and he was like really lonely and had like complete contempt for humankind. And his way of expressing that contempt for humankind was to be miserable. And the Renaissance people decided to call him the weeping philosopher. And he wrote all this really obscure philosophy, and I like to think of him a bit as the Sad Keanu of his time. And so, yeah, he wrote all these obscure words, and most of them have been lost to time forever. And when you read back through them, like only a handful of them make any sense at all. There's one that he said, "The sun is the width of a foot." I'm like, yeah, whatever that means. And so hardly any of his work survives. But before he died, and he died of this really weird, bizarre death where he was like 60 years old and he had edema, and the physicians of his time were like, "Sorry, there's nothing we can do for you." And he was like, "It's cool, I've got an idea." And he went and rubbed cow shit all over himself and went and sat in the sun until it baked, because he was convinced this would cure him, and then he died the next day. Yeah, like a proper candidate for the Darwin Award. But before he died, he left us with some really interesting ideas. Like one of them was this idea of an ever-changing world. And he was like, the world is always changing. The only thing that you can have as a guarantee is that everything is in a permanent state of flux. And that any illusion, or any thing that you think of as static is just an illusion. And he had this really like great kind of line that I like and that I'm going to come back to in a second. And another guy was this guy, Democritus. He was a contemporary of Socrates, but was considered among the last of the pre-Socratics. And like Heraclitus, he had this really strong contempt for humankind. But because he dealt with that as being like really happy and cheerful, he became known as the laughing philosopher. Or his citizens knew him as the mocker. And so I think he might have been the world's first troll. And he had really modern ideas. So he and his mentor, Leucippus, like, came up with the idea of like, the conservation of mass and energy, the indirect nature of perception, the creation and destruction of physical systems, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But they're best known for an early attempt at an atomic conception of the universe. And they developed this idea to try and reconcile the previous guy, like Sadkiano, his idea of an ever-changing world, with this other guy that he lived at the same time as, called Parmenides. And his idea was that the world was completely static and that change was an illusion. And so the idea was like, well, atoms are these like things that never change, they're eternal, but they just like bounce around and make all these new things. And so the changes in this, the changes that surface layer that the atoms kind of that aren't changing bring about. But perhaps because of his trolling nature, like Plato and Aristotle were like, we hate you, your work sucks, and they like wrote him kind of out of history and wanted to burn all of his books. And so we had this idea of a static universe that took over, and that came with all of the other amazing stuff that Plato and Aristotle did. But then these amazing ideas, like the atomic conception of the universe and all the other stuff like that, and this idea of an ever-changing world, those ideas were sandboxed for about 2,000 years until they were rediscovered at a later time. And so when you look at that, and you look back and you think, these are these incredibly modern ideas that modern science has now brought about in a much more sophisticated way, it's really interesting to look at how that came about and how that context meant that those ideas were lost until there was a good time to bring them back. And this brings me back to like Heraclitus, who had this this thing that really stuck with me, which is this idea that you can't ever go back to the same river twice, blah, blah, blah. And basically, the way I always understood it was that the context is never the same. So when you revisit this metaphorical river, both the river is different and you are different. And so it's this idea, like a license to go back and always revisit things, because you know that they can't be the same. And that if you, say, had this like data point that you were looking at, and this came from like 4 years ago, it's difficult to really believe that that necessarily reflects the current context. And so despite that, I don't think it's really fair to criticize Plato or Aristotle for rejecting those ideas, because in that world, there was like no evidence to suggest that those ideas were of any merit. And so you can't really have a go at them. Those ideas came back when the time was right, I suppose, and when the dust settled and the Renaissance rediscovered them, and then modern science came about. And I feel like the discipline of front-end development is very much this world of ever-changing context. I feel like every year more stuff comes about than I could ever know of, and I have to keep doubting whether or not the things that I hold, that I sort of internalize as assumptions can even be valid 6 months down the line. And a lot of our best practices are born from this idea of looking for universal truths from a specific context, and then we drag them forward with us for the rest of time, even if the context is changing. And that's going to be a recurring theme that I'm going to bring up as I look over some of the classic HTML and CSS best practices. And so yeah, HTML used to be sort of like this, although probably all caps. And as HTML grew and became more and more popular, the people who were building websites wanted more and more style capabilities. And the cost of this was ever more complicated HTML, inconsistent implementations, and inconsistent appearances in the browser. And on top of that, people had difficulty customizing the appearance of a website that they were viewing, because all of it was like hard-coded, like really hard style into the HTML itself. And then around the time that the W3C was forming in 1994, people were working on a specification that borrowed a whole bunch of ideas from different specifications that came to be known as CSS. And in 1996, that became a W3C recommendation. And when you look through that original spec, there's a few interesting bits in there. And one of them is the fact that, at least as far as I can tell, the class attribute was added to HTML for the purposes of what CSS was trying to achieve, which was to have, like, give you slightly greater control over the appearance of things, but not in a way that means that you have to like write it directly into the HTML itself. You kind of use this interface, which is a class, in order to hook your styles into it. And throughout the early parts of that spec, if you have a look through it, you can feel that there's this concern that the introduction of this powerful new technology could potentially undermine everything they've been trying to achieve with the universal semantics of HTML. Because I could come along and I could just throw like any divs or whatever I wanted, and then I could just build my structure in a domain-specific way using classes and using CSS. And so I think that kind of like carried through, and they did a really good job of making sure that, that people didn't just go and do whatever they wanted with CSS. And one of the most famous examples of this like early evangelism of how we could author websites with what later became like HTML4 and CSS like 2.1 was the CSS Zen Garden. And this site, I think, is from 2003 originally. And if you're not familiar with it, it's this idea of there's just like one page of HTML, and then the idea would people would submit new style sheets that would give you completely different presentations. And it was like a really powerful way of promoting the use of semantic markup and the power of CSS. But out of this world and this reaction against the pre-CSS authoring days came some of these things that we kind of like parrot back to each other a lot. And one of them is don't use unsemantic class names, whatever that means. And you see it in different guises, which is something like this. Like this guy called Croc came and he wrote, "Your HTML like diamond should be forever." And this is this idea of, you know, the HTML will never change, and CSS is where all of the change that goes on happens. You shouldn't be changing your HTML. And this kind of discourse has been assimilated even into the HTML5 spec, this idea of content-derived class name semantics. And alternative approaches over the last 10 years have been like repeatedly purged as the mark of amateurs, not as a best practice, and kind of echoing this fear of a threat to the semantic web. And I've been down this road myself. This is the context within which I learned web development. And when I was building my blog, I went down this road of, I am not going to have any classes whatsoever in my blog. It's going to be this bastion of purity and perfection. And I spent ages, I'd like file over every single piece of white space and trying to make it as perfect as possible. And I was really proud of that blog. And then I went and spent 6 months like working on a real job. And when I came back to my blog and I wanted to make some trivial change, I was completely lost. And I was looking through this code thinking, this is the worst code ever. Like, how did anyone think that this was a good idea? Well, how did I think this was a good idea? Had all these like nested descendant selectors. It was so difficult to work with. And I spent a long time basically just trying to work out what I was trying to do and then refactoring that to use classes and go back to being sensible. So that was like an extreme, but I think it's kind of interesting to look again back at the CSS spec and understand what was going on at the time. And so despite this, I think, being originally drafted as a warning, which again repeats this idea that HTML is a universal meaning, and you shouldn't sacrifice the universal meaning that you can get from HTML for this domain-specific meaning that you get from CSS, or from classes, rather. I think it also contains like the seed of an idea that was completely abandoned in what became a dogmatic approach to writing HTML, which is that we can use a domain-specific meaning, and that classes can be used to reflect the structure of our presentation. And so this idea that semantics should be completely separate from presentation implies that semantics, which is just meaning, is the preserve of only one sort of information, which is HTML and HTML elements and HTML attributes. But in reality, class names were originally created for us, not for machines. And as long as we're responsible in the way that we use classes and we understand them as a layer that exists separate from the layer of HTML, then we can use the content layer semantics, which are already served by HTML, and then like move on and use classes which themselves impart little or no semantic information to machines, but they provide a lot to us as this primary mechanism within which we reflect a presentational structure. And that can take any form that you want. You can be like highly prescriptive, or you can be slightly loose. But the point is that that interface is mainly an area for us, and that reflecting the HTML like content-derived semantics again in the class is kind of not necessarily particularly useful, in particular in the context of large web app development, where the complexity of the interface and the variety of the content that can appear in various parts of the interface makes that practice like, very difficult to work with. And so that doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice the universal semantics of HTML. It's kind of completely the opposite, in fact. What we're saying is we should decouple the presentation semantics from the document semantics and hopefully improve both of them as a result. And that kind of leads into what I'm going to call ugly class names. And this is an example of not an ugly class name. And this is this dominant trend that we have at the moment of hyphenated lowercase class names. And I say like trend or like style, like fashion, because before that was camel case and before that was underscore, or a mixture of whatever. But the main idea is there's no reason that this is happening other than like for aesthetic reasons, as far as I can tell. I certainly wasn't aware of any other reasons than aesthetic reasons. Or perhaps some minor issues to do with not wanting underscores in your CSS because they're in your JavaScript. And the consequence of that is that in the context of, again, in particular large web apps where you might have hundreds of developers and hundreds of pages, the complexity of the relationships between your components and within your components can be quite great. So when you look at that example, there's like, it's difficult to tell where a component starts, where a modifier ends, and what is a child, because maybe button group is actually a modifier of button, whereas we know that primary in this case is meant to be a modifier of the button component. And then again, like button group item is like, how do I even know that that is necessarily meant to be part of button group? And so it's not necessarily an optimal approach to kind of hold to this way of writing, of like formatting your classes. Whereas like an ugly class name pattern like this, which was, as far as I'm aware, like originally pioneered by Yandex, who are like a Russian search giant, and they have like hundreds and hundreds of sites and hundreds of developers reusing all this code and stuff. And I read about this about a year ago, and I've repeatedly adapted the notation that they've used. And I'm now quite liking this one, which Montage came up with. It's like an open source project. But when you look at this, you have like a consistent pattern in the class name. So you have anything with no hyphens at all is a component name. So button or a camel case button group, because it's easier to read than just all being one word. In this instance, a double hyphen is indication of a modifier class. So I would have button and then button double hyphen primary. And this would kind of extend button in some way. And then a single hyphen indicates a child node. So I'm kind of trying to reflect the structure of my UI component in the class names. And then hopefully when I read the DOM as well, I can look through and go, well, all of these classes that are in this pile of HTML, I can kind of derive the relationship between certain clusters of classes and which ones are not related, which is particularly helpful when you have, these large web applications. And it's like extensible. You could namespace it. So I'm working on something at Twitter at the moment where I have like a util namespace, which is like a low-level set of base styles that I want to keep separate from the components. So it's kind of flexible, and it's useful in the right context. And I guess the main idea is just that there's no reason to violently stick to hyphens and lowercase as the format for writing your classes. Because if we can throw in a bit more meaning into the class name in an environment where it matters, then that's something that we should be prepared to do. And rather than recoiling at the like ugliness of something that we're not used to, it's worth kind of considering it and looking at what it's trying to do outside of the context of these original ideas, which is that we were just building really simple logs and things like that. And so like the important thing is this isn't an alternative best practice, or like the past way was wrong and this way is right. It's a different context, like a contextual practice, if you want. And it might survive and be iterated upon, or it might die when the development landscape changes. It doesn't really matter either way. And I'm going to go on to one of the most contentious aspects, which is this idea of using extra elements. And by extra elements, I mean stuff like an empty div or whatever in your markup. And my slides have stopped loading. Oh well, I'll try and wing it from here. So like you have your empty div in the markup somewhere, and then you use that to like render an icon or something like that. And this is like normally frowned upon, and I went like hardcore into the pseudo element hack world in order to try and reduce the amount of superfluous HTML. But by doing that, you make it much more complicated what's going on in that piece of markup. There's all this extra bit of UI that's appearing and that you don't really know where it's come from. And if you look into the web component spec, which I'm going to use as like I'm not going to go into any detail at all on it. It's an amazing specification with a lot of really interesting ideas, but I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to talk about it here. But I'm going to use it as a kind of a surface upon which I'm going to throw this best practice to examine it in a little bit more detail. And the web component spec has this idea of packaging up your UI into smaller components and having tight pieces of HTML and CSS and JavaScript all together, and reflecting the reality of the current declarative authoring experience that you have in JavaScript libraries and things like this, which is where if you want to build a date picker, there's this huge chunk of DOM that gets created somewhere and then injected into your document. And what they're trying to do is move away from that and have you be able to author that in a native templating format. And when you look through that specification, it has this, it introduces it with this idea of providing a visual richness not possible with CSS alone, which sounds amazing. You're probably thinking, wow, I definitely want to use this. What do I have to do? And as you read a bit further, it talks about decorators and elements and templates, and there's this line in there that says, specify additional presentation using markup, which might cause a lot of people to be quite concerned that something like that is making its way back into technical specifications. But if you look at it a bit deeper, it's not suggesting that a return back to the bad old ways, but it's also not rejecting the reality of the current authoring environment, which is that declarative authoring of widgets is popular and works, and it's a simple interface. And using an empty div to do something doesn't sacrifice the universal semantics of your HTML. It makes no difference at all to have that in there. And so it's not necessarily worth rejecting that use simply because of a fear that it would affect the future of the web and the idea of being able to parse all the documents in the web to extract all this wonderful information. But at the same time, it's not great to be injecting everywhere that you go all of this custom junk markup into the DOM. It makes it very hard to debug. It's increasing the noise to signal ratio. And so they have this idea of one of the ideas is a custom element. And so you have your template where you stick all of the HTML that you're going to use to help you provide this richer experience, this richer visual for your element. And then you attach that to a native DOM node that you're extending. And when you've attached it to that node, all of the stuff in the templating tag, all of the additional HTML that you're using and the CSS gets bundled into a shadow DOM tree and kept in a completely separate functional space. So you can have the simple, clean, rich semantics of a button, and then you can extend that in any way that you want, and you can use all of the native prototype. You don't have to rebuild the web from scratch in order to have a button that is simply not possible with the current web implementations. And I think that's a really interesting and powerful approach to the future of web development, which also makes not a mockery of, but it exposes the myth of this idea that HTML can't be used to help us with presentation, that it's the wrong tool for the job. Whereas I think CSS is the wrong tool for the job in terms of providing a structure to all parts of presentation. And so the web component spec is definitely something that is worth checking out. And so this brings me back to the quote from Heraclitus, which is this idea of revisiting the river. And I think that's something that we should be prepared to do, which is to go back and these things that we've taken for granted and the things that, as part of our job, we are just assuming are always true. Sometimes, in the different contexts, they won't be. And so if we go back and explore those things and don't reject ideas that come from other sources with a knee-jerk reaction, but appreciate that we're working in this industry where things change so rapidly that it's really hard to believe that the best practices that were created in a context of 10 years ago, even just a few years ago, necessarily hold true to the context within which we're working, both as a general community of developers, but then also as individuals working on specific sites and specific problems. And so if we look at the context that we're in and the context in which these ideas that we are inheriting have come from, sometimes there is not going to be a clean overlap. And that's the space at which we should be prepared to innovate and to avoid just mimicking and parroting the things that have been handed down to us or the things that we've created ourselves, and be prepared to move on and do something original. And that's it. Thanks. I'm not going to do a Q&A, but I'll hang around afterwards so you can come and see me if you need to say something. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicolas. And that was Nicolas's first.